Making headlines for this week of April 22nd. Will to action. Like planet Earth at this time, the people are coming to life and rumbling for change. Tragedy of Ukraine. Leadership in turmoil, a country in distress, and a possible hidden agenda from a suppressed historical reference. Indigenous crisis in Canada. Rash of suicides among youth, yet leadership from both sides appear to be missing the real point of the issue. And a new gold fix arrives. China launches yuan-based gold price fix while signaling that U.S. dollars are not welcome.
With news around, upon, within, and beyond our planet, the program making disclosure official. This is Cosmic Vision News. Here is Jeffrey West.
Greetings and blessings to all. Just as the volcanoes and earthquakes are ramping up all over the world, so too are the voices of populations that have been repressed and are now showing signs of rumbling to life. The energies of protest appear to be building up again within people in at least several places of interest around the world over the last couple of weeks. And once again, they are the kinds of protests that generally receive little, if any, attention from the mainstream media. We start first in France. An English-language newspaper in France, the local.fr, asked the question on April the 4th whether France was witnessing the birth of its own Occupy moment. This article writes that for the past 4 nights, crowds have been gathering in public squares across France, including Place de la République in France, or in Paris rather, and staying there throughout the nights. They have a General Assembly meet at 6 p.m. where they discuss ideas and vote on whether to return the next night. And they're quite a peaceful group, and they wave their hands rather than clapping, for instance, which is surely a welcome relief for anyone living nearby and trying to sleep. The groups get moved on by police each morning, and then return soon later that day. The movement has been given the name Nuit debout, which roughly translates as rise up at night, or up all night, according to another source. The movement began around March 31st, as waves of discontent began to swell within the people against new labor law reforms. In answering the question about why people are there, the article adds that they have a big and somewhat vague anti-establishment dream. It's become a lot more than just about labor reforms. In fact, and many have drawn parallels between the Occupy movement in the U.S. and the Indignados movement in Spain, both from 2011. These protests are beginning to incorporate messages of support for a number of other local issues, but also, as the article writes, some protesters have talked about reconstructing a system that starts with the citizens, claiming that they're unhappy with the way the French government is running the country. Political scientist Gaël Brustier was quoted as saying in a Le Figaro article that it's an emerging social movement, and it's still fragile, but it's becoming more important one small step at a time. The movement has been led intelligently since the beginning, and that a social movement is being born. Lauren Macaulay, writing for commondreams.org, noted that the protests were beginning to grow in other European locations as well. She writes that demonstrations this weekend were held in as many as 60 cities and towns across France, as well as in Belgium, Germany, and Spain, according to reports, as an estimated 120,000 people protested against austerity, globalization, increased inequality, privatization, and the continent's severe anti-migrant policies. Angelique Christophas, in an article on the Guardian.com website on April the 8th, writes, despite France's long history of youth protest movements, from May 1968 to vast rallies against pension changes, Nuit debout, which has spread to cities such as Toulouse, Lyon, and Nantes, and even over the border to Brussels, is seen as a new phenomenon. Christophas quotes one participant as saying that there's something here that I've never seen before in France. all these people converge here each night of their own accord to talk and debate ideas, from housing to the universal wages, refugees, any topic they like. No one has told them to. No unions are pushing them on. They're coming of their own accord. Another protester in this article was quoted as saying, "The labor law was the final straw, but it's much bigger than that. This government, which is supposed to be socialist, has come up with a raft of things I don't agree with, while failing to deal with the real problems like unemployment, climate change, and a society heading for disaster." Jocelyn, reported as a former medical student acting as a press spokesperson for the movement, said, "There are parallels with Occupy and Indignados. The idea is to let everyone speak out. People are really sick and tired, and that feeling has been building for years. Everything Hollande, President Hollande, once promised for the left but gave up on really gets me down. Personally, it's the state of emergency, the new surveillance laws, the changes to the justice system, and the security crackdown." In France, the expression "Vive la Révolution" appears to be being born again. Revolution appears to be the word elsewhere also. We turn to Iceland now. In the continuing fallout of the revelations of the current Icelandic leader having connections to the Panama Papers and to having his own tax shelter abroad, the people appear determined to voice their message that they have had enough of the current government. An article on the icenews.is website on April 5th reported 15,000 people as coming out to protest on that day alone. And although that may not seem like a lot, it is worth considering that this represents about 5% of the entire population of the country standing up and speaking out in public. According to this article, the message was loud and clear. The ruling parties must dissolve the government. The Prime Minister must resign. Elections must be held ahead of schedule. The Prime Minister has resigned, as was reported on CVN 2 weeks ago. There is no word yet on when an election will be called, but the bad news for any politicians connected to the establishment in that country is that the Pirate Party is now positioned to move into leadership in that country. Nick Robbins-Early, reporting for the Huffington Post on April the 11th, wrote that Iceland's once fringe radical Pirate Party has surged since the Panama Papers leak to become the nation's most popular party. More than 43% of respondents in a media poll released last week said they would vote for the Pirates, the most for any party. That's a significant gain from last month, before the Panama Papers implicated the Prime Minister and members of his cabinet in offshore accounts, when a poll put the party at almost 24% of the vote. The article adds that the Iceland Pirate Party's wide-ranging platform includes direct democracy, changes to Iceland's constitution, and reform of copyright law, as well as granting asylum to American leaker Edward Snowden. If elected, Brigitte Jonsdottir, said the party would aim to quickly change the constitution to match a proposal written by crowdsourcing Icelanders that failed in 2013. A large percentage of Icelanders have become disillusioned with the country's political and financial establishment since the 2008 financial crisis. A Gallup poll last month showed that only 17% of Icelanders trust their parliament. The Pirates have capitalized on this discontent and pledge transparency to combat corruption. The international media have begun to take notice of what is going on in Iceland, and this is a very good thing, I believe. Moving over to the United States now, and although there is the ongoing election fiasco in the Democratic primaries that is creating a revolution of its own within the national population, there is also the underreported or totally ignored protests taking place in Washington, D.C. Protests there were leading to hundreds of arrests, and the mainstream media was generally silent. In an article on April the 11th by Nathan Wellman on the US Uncut.com news website, the following was written. Initial reports suggest that hundreds of protesters are being arrested outside Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. right now for participating in a peaceful demonstration against corporate money in politics. One individual who sent out a message via Twitter stated the following. Hashtag Democracy Spring is going, and apparently has the most arrests at the Capitol in history. Why is this not on the news? The article continues. The Democracy Spring website says that the campaign's goal is to demand a Congress that will take immediate action to end the corruption of big money in our politics and ensure free and fair elections in which every American has an equal voice. Furthermore, the proposals include support of the Government by the People Act and Fair Elections Now Act, the Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2015 and Voter Empowerment Act of 2015, and the Democracy for All amendments. The website reports that over 3,600 people have pledged to take part in this act of civil disobedience, though a final number has yet to be confirmed. Police were quickly called to the scene and they began arresting people not even an hour after the protests begun. Peter Overby, writing for the National Public Radio, NPR, on April the 11th, reported that in a rally preceding the protest, organizer Kai Newkirk of the group 99rise.org told the crowd that we send a message to everyone in our country who needs a government that represents us all, that this house is your house too, and now it is time to stand up and take it back. The coalition wants a Congress of conscience to pass legislation limiting undisclosed and big donor money, giving more clout to small donors, to restore powers in the Voting Rights Act, and to put an end to gerrymandered districts that insulate incumbent lawmakers from election challenges. So although you may not be hearing about it, or reading about it, or seeing anything about it in various media around the world, do not think that your voice or your actions will mean nothing. There are tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, and arguably perhaps even millions of discontent people worldwide wondering if they should take action for change and take the risk. CVN is here to tell you that there are people courageously taking those risks for you worldwide, for your family and for the children of this world. They are prepared to do what they have to do without the weapons and the badges that protect police and military personnel who seek to serve and protect the establishment. Being informed about what is going on is one really huge part of this shift in consciousness and this wave of change. Making choices, whatever choices are meaningful to you in serving this shift, however, is what is being asked of you at this time. In other geopolitical news, a situation that was originally planned to be pretty easy, but eventually became more difficult, has become even more difficult in Ukraine. The Western coup, led by the US, Israel, and other Western countries that upset the structures of governance in Ukraine in 2014, was supposed to pave the way for easy bailouts of the country, to enslave the people to fraudulent debt, while giving them very little in return but an excessive tax bill through austerity measures. It was supposed to give the people the illusion of a better world with visa-free access to European countries and possibly a few other perks. None of this appears to have happened, and all the promises made to the Ukraine people have basically gone up in smoke. On April 10th, RT reported that after weeks of political crisis in Kiev, Ukrainian Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk has announced his long-expected resignation. The Prime Minister has been a highly unpopular figure in Ukraine, with his approval ratings languishing in the single-digit range. The public blames him for a ruined economy and the failure to implement reforms he had promised when taking office following the February 2014 coup. The article adds that the final stages of his tenure were marred by an ugly political scandal when his economy minister, Aivaras Abramovicius, announced his resignation over alleged corruption in the Ukrainian government. As the crisis unfolded, the ruling coalition in the Ukrainian parliament collapsed. Under Ukrainian law, President Petro Poroshenko can call an early election if a new coalition isn't formed. But opinion polls say his own party would lose seats in that case as well. Poroshenko tried to resolve the debacle in the cabinet by calling on Yatsenyuk to resign, but he initially refused to do so. An attempt to fire him through a parliamentary vote failed in what was a major embarrassment for the president. Yatsenyuk said the ongoing political crisis in Ukraine was created artificially and has become personal for politicians. Yatsenyuk has tried to position his government as the best in the history of Ukraine, and that it is a manifestation of the new Ukraine. Yatsenyuk has claimed to want new electoral laws, constitutional reform, judicial reform, coalition control over the direction of the government, Ukraine membership in the EU, and also in NATO. If all these so-called reforms are under the direct supervision of the US and the EU, it is a very safe bet that these reforms will not be good for the average Ukraine citizen. The people, hopefully, are starting to catch on to what has been done to them. The RT article adds that Gilbert Doctorow of Russia Insider pointed out that Yatsenyuk's resignation occurred shortly after Ukraine's association agreement with the EU had been rejected in a Dutch referendum. This raised the feeling of crisis within the Ukrainian political elites and made Yatsenyuk's departure something essential, so they would have a sacrificial lamb and they would appear before Europeans in particular and the IMF as well to create the illusion that they are making some progress in putting their house in order, he told RT. Doctorow said that Kiev is keenly aware of what its European partners are saying about Ukraine's EU aspirations. The Ukraine is not going to join the EU anytime soon, and in fact not in the next 20 to 30 years, which in political terms means never, he said, adding that this was very damaging to the Ukrainian leadership's image at home. Even this story has its complications because it is tied to a deeper story that has been more or less erased from the history books. It is a story that potentially explains why Israel may be more than interested and involved in the destabilization of Ukraine and the events that are happening in this country. The split that has now occurred between the eastern part of Ukraine and the western part of the country has the potential to upset what could have been part of an elaborate plan to reclaim the historical lands known as Khazaria. The lands allegedly linked to the mafia that is allegedly pulling most, if not all, of the strings of planetary enslavement at this time. An article appearing on the MaltaNow.com website by Graham Pick appears to have done extensive research into the history of this little-known historical country. Pick writes, the Khazars originally were an Asiatic Mongoloid nation. From time immemorial, the homeland of the Khazars was in the heart of Asia. It was a very hostile nation, constantly at war with its neighbors. The Khazars were finally driven out of Asia by neighboring countries in Asia with whom they were continually at war. The Khazars fled their Asian homeland and invaded Eastern Europe to escape further defeats in Asia. The very hostile Khazars did not find it difficult to subdue and conquer the 25 peaceful agricultural nations occupying approximately 1 million square miles in Eastern Europe. In a comparatively short period, the Khazars established the largest and most powerful kingdom in Europe and probably the wealthiest also. The Khazars were a pagan nation when they invaded Eastern Europe. Their historical religious doctrines were a mixture of phallic worship and other forms of idolatrous reverence practiced in Asia by several pagan nations. The vile forms of sexual excess indulged in by the Khazars as their form of religious worship degenerated into a degree of debauched moral decadence unparalleled by any other nation of the time. The story gets more intriguing, noting the king at that time, Bulan, who became fed up with phallic worship and decreed that all of the country would convert to Judaism, and he brought in rabbis from Babylonia to oversee the transition. Synagogues were built, and people were educated in the ways of Judaism. As Pick writes, the converted Khazars were the first population of the so-called or self-styled Jews in Eastern Europe. Pick also notes a very dark undertone to this conversion. He writes the following: despite this mass conversion by the king and his subjects, there remained a select secret circle of oligarchs who continued practicing ancient Babylonian black magic, also known as secret Satanism. This secret Satanism involved occult ceremonies featuring child sacrifice, after bleeding them out, drinking their blood, and eating their hearts. The deep, dark secret of those occult practices was that they were all based on ancient Baal worship, also known as worship of the owl. In order to deceive the Khazarian king, this clandestine group melded these Luciferian black magic practices with Judaism and created a secret satanic hybrid religion known as Babylonian Talmudism. This occult form of Judaism was surreptitiously practiced in Khazaria, and it nurtured the same evil that Khazaria was known for previously. The conquest of the Khazar Empire by the Russians around the 13th century explains the Jewish presence in Russia. These populations became known as Yiddish. The Yiddish language, however, is not the same as Hebrew, although it uses the same characters that were taken from the Talmud, and a new language was created. After the 13th century, Russia was forced to start ceding large parcels of land, and thus many new countries were born, such as Poland, Lithuania, Galicia, Hungary, Romania, and Austria, which were originally part of this Khazarian empire. Judaism was on the verge of death, but the conversion of the Khazarian Empire to Judaism gave it a massive rebirth. Pick writes the following: these so-called Jews of Eastern European origin make up at least 90% of the world's present total population of Jews. Judaism was given the greatest stimulus in all its history with the conversion of the large pagan Khazar population in the 7th century. Fast forward to the 19th century, and thus came the birth of the Zionist movement, a movement dedicated to the creation of a specific physical homeland for the Jewish people. Pick continues: the principles of the Zionist movement began to permeate throughout Ashkenazi Khazarian Jewish communities worldwide, and many became enthralled by the notion of returning to their alleged historical biblical homeland, even though in reality it was not. The Balfour Declaration in 1917 was the UK government's recognition that a homeland be established for the Jewish people on the lands formerly known as Palestine. In May of 1948, the State of Israel was founded. Pick writes the following: Ashkenazi Jews flocked to their newfound homeland in droves and rapidly expanded their borders beyond their intended limits. Since the inception of the State of Israel in 1948, and especially since 1967, Israel has relentlessly, brutally, and uncompromisingly expanded their borders into Palestinian land. These Jewish usurpers have seized land, stolen farms, and demolished Palestinian homes with unrelenting ruthlessness and unforgiving vindictiveness. The Jewish people have believed that they were entitled to this land as they were the chosen people, quote unquote. If we take a moment to look at the bigger picture for a moment to understand the spiritual growth and evolution of humanity, it was necessary for a certain group of souls to participate in a very extreme act of darkness and low vibration in order for humanity to experience what we have experienced. This was necessary for our spiritual growth, something that many are now coming to understand. In a sense, this lower vibration Khazarian race became the so-called chosen people who would take humanity through this period of darkness, allowing humanity to begin awakening to who they really are. I realize that there will be some who will say that this is utter crap, and that is perfectly okay. But I am very certain that many of you will be able to connect the dots of this story to all that is happening in the world at this time. Pick states that this belief of the Jewish people is a monumental lie. He writes, 90% of the inhabitants of modern-day Israel are not descendants of Abraham or any other biblical predecessor. In fact, they have next to no Middle Eastern blood in their veins. Ashkenazi Jews have no hereditary right whatsoever to the lands they now inhabit. This may explain why the whole campaign in Ukraine was doctored by the U.S., perhaps directly on behalf of Israel. It was perhaps an attempt to re-secure the ancient and very fertile lands of Ukraine in order to look after themselves, especially since the world is now beginning to stand up and speak out in support of Palestine. It is no secret that the Israeli lobby in the U.S. is the most powerful group controlling the U.S. Congress. An article on the investmentwatchblog.com website on March 20th of 2015 shows a map with the results of a survey about who is believed to be the biggest threat to world peace. According to results from around the world, the United States is deemed to be the biggest threat to world peace, while strangely, in Canada and the U.S., they see Iran as the biggest threat. This highlights the power of the media and the message coming from U.S. Zionist-controlled interests. Now, Iran is located at the southern border of the former Khazarian Empire, so this may explain a lot. Even in 2014, a Gallup International poll showed the same result. The article, appearing on the International Business Times website in 2014, wrote that more than 66,000 people across 65 nations, and this found that 24% of all respondents answered that the United States is the greatest threat to peace in the world today. Pakistan and China fell significantly behind the U.S. in the poll with 8 and 6% respectively. Afghanistan, Iran, Israel, and North Korea all tied for fourth place with 4%. Lada Ray, on her blog site, addressed this issue of Ukraine and noted the following. Unfortunately, this U.S.-EU project called Ukro-Nazi Oligarchic and Russophobic Kiev Junta has plunged the territory formerly known as Ukraine into disaster, destroyed its economy, currency, and created enemies out of people who used to call themselves brothers. But the bottom still has not been reached. There is still some way to fall. Her posting also notes how the IMF is again backing away from giving Ukraine more bailout money, suggesting that something has shifted as far as Ukraine is concerned. Whether this is linked to the world turning against Israel at this time remains to be seen. Ray also notes that one of only 2 Ukraine politicians who have allegedly profited from the Western-sanctioned coup is President Poroshenko, whose wealth allegedly increased from $600 million to over several $billion. She provides a link in her article explaining this. The other who profited was Prime Minister Yatsenyuk. Ray alleges that he stole over $1 billion, and he has also acquired Canadian citizenship. Not something usually done by someone who claims to be running the best government in the history of Ukraine. Both leaders and other politicians are alleged to have private aircraft on standby in case they should be forced to flee the country. Ray also notes a French TV report showing a map of Ukraine, and France appears to be acknowledging the existence of the breakaway region in Ukraine as being Novorossiya. This could be a very significant step in terms of geopolitical relations concerning Ukraine. Perhaps all this historical relevance may give you an idea about how things are connected into the greater perspective about what is happening in the world at this time. Shifting further east for a few moments now, there is another upcoming election that is worth keeping an eye on. The geopolitics.co website reported on April 12th that the presidential election in the Philippines comes on May 9th of this year, and it is no ordinary electoral exercise. This is the first time that all sectors and economic classes of our society are united in making sure that the strong man from the South is inaugurated to the highest office in the land. The article continues. There is a very high possibility that if the oligarchy decides to manipulate the elections like they did in 1992 when they put CIA stooge Fidel Ramos in power, succeeding another Jesuit CIA stooge, Corazon Aquino, who has proven to be ineffective in nation building in the post-Marcos dictatorship, there will be a full-spectrum revolution if the next CIA stooge is elected, and the rebels are already armed in the South. Rodrigo Duterte is becoming the next potential leader to publicly challenge U.S. and Western hegemony. He refuses to dance to the White House tune. The article also notes the following. Aside from having an independent foreign policy, the Duterte presidency is expected to bring peace to the country, as both the communists, who have been waging proactive war against government for 40 years now, and Muslim secessionist groups in the South, who have been in perpetual rebellion for the last 400 years, are in full support of the Duterte candidacy. In fact, these two groups are ready to resume the armed struggle if Duterte is cheated in the upcoming elections. A Duterte win will likely lead to some violence, as he has stated his intention to increase salaries of police officers to entice them to do their jobs in cracking down on corrupt drug and kidnapping syndicates. He has apparently warned the top 3 police generals to retire before he is elected, or they may face arrest. No other candidate has yet been able to produce any evidence of corruption on the part of Duterte during his 22 years as mayor of Davao City. This could lead some to believe that he is incorruptible, and this should strike a tone of fear into any group attempting to manipulate the outcome of this election. CVN will be keeping an eye on this upcoming election, and we shall begin to see what happens or begins to unfold in this Southeast Asian country. In this week's Mohawk Initiative update, several events outside of the Grand River Mohawk community have been taking place that are worthy of noting this week as Indigenous issues are brought more and more into general public awareness. There is one story of concern, however, and sadly it is not an isolated story, but this particular story is the one that seems to be getting the attention of the media. This is also not the first time that this particular community has been featured in the news. Back in 2012-2013, this same community was embroiled in a housing crisis during the winter. It was at this time that Teresa Spence, the elected band chief of the Attawapiskat First Nation, went to Ottawa and conducted a 6-week hunger strike that got international media coverage to the issues facing Indigenous nations and her community in particular. The Prime Minister at that time, Stephen Harper, had been refusing to meet with her, although the Liberal leader Justin Trudeau did make the public gesture to meet with her and hear about her issues. That hunger strike brought her enough media coverage that allowed her to get re-elected as band chief a number of months later. However, Spence resigned as chief of the Attawapiskat First Nation 2 years later in August of 2015. Now it seems that there is a suicide crisis breaking out in this band as a number of youth have decided that it is no longer worth living. A question is arising, however, about who is responsible for this situation. A CBC article by Duncan McHugh on April 18th suggests that the problems facing Indigenous nations in crises are all within the community, and that it is the community that must create the solutions. McHugh's article compares the remote Attawapiskat First Nation with the urban-based Snuneymuxw First Nation in Nanaimo, British Columbia, on Canada's west coast. This First Nation formerly had suicide problems, but they have now addressed the issue, claiming to have done it on their own. In this week's Final Words, I'll offer a commentary on this article, suggesting that all the solutions to an Indigenous community in crisis are within the community itself, an opinion that I choose to challenge. There is sadly, however, another piece of information that has not received a lot of attention regarding this community and this chief. This information seems to suggest that the youth of Attawapiskat were betrayed not only by governments, but perhaps also by their own leadership. An opinion letter appearing on the NorthumberlandToday.com news website from January of 2013, around the time that Spence was on her hunger strike, contained what appears to be research by an individual, Wally Keeler. And this letter implies that the Attawapiskat First Nation, at least at that time, had a significant stock portfolio of major corporations, many of which are connected to the global cabal and are responsible for environmental destruction, something that many Indigenous peoples are beginning to rise up against. Keeler acknowledges all the attention and accolades placed upon Spence during her hunger strike, but then he reveals his information. According to Keeler, in this letter, the Attawapiskat Trust has a stock portfolio that would make any liberal, leftist, and or environmentalist proud to hang their eagle feather next to this corporate nest egg. The trust holds a hefty number of positive shares, or rather productive shares, in 8 Canadian gas and oil companies, as well as 2 pipeline corporations, Pembina Pipeline and the much-beloved Enbridge. Offshore, the trust holds Occidental Petroleum, ExxonMobil, Petróleo Brasileiro, a huge chunk of Vancifio Technologies, a Chinese offshore software developer, Pfizer, the pharmaceutical giant, Siemens, the bioagricultural giant and technological giant, and then there's that darling of liberals and leftists everywhere, Halliburton Corporation. Many will recognize that name as the company owned by former Vice President Dick Cheney. What is hypocritical about this is that many Indigenous nations are fighting against Enbridge for the damage being done by their pipelines, and yet this chief and her husband appear to be profiting from the very same companies that their brothers and sisters are fighting against. This leader has claimed to be fighting for her people, and yet she is profiting from the corporations that are stealing and destroying their lands, their way of life, and their culture. Is it any wonder, therefore, why young people are committing suicide? So it is becoming increasingly and vitally important to understand the context from which this very complicated Indigenous issue arises. As has been mentioned many times on this newscast, there are primarily 2 Indigenous groups in Canada and arguably other countries. There is the corporate entity Indigenous bands that surrendered their rights and freedoms and their lands to the corporate Canadian government, and also to the corporate Assembly of First Nations, and also to the commercial contract, also known as legislation, called the Indian Act. Then there are the groups that live naturally free of corporate enslavement because they chose not to surrender their rights, their freedoms, nor their lands to corporate interests. The problems, however, is that corporate interests have continued to impose their will upon those truly free Indigenous nations, knowing that these nations will likely not have access to the kind of legal information and knowledge that would help them to defend their land claims and rights. This is essentially what the Mohawk Initiative is about, providing the legal precedent that will allow the Mohawks and perhaps eventually all Indigenous nations choosing to live truly free of corporate enslavement to reclaim this freedom and work together with the rapidly increasing number of awake and aware people who are wanting to live in ways that are more harmonious and peaceful to humanity and to our planet. The suicide crisis in Attawapiskat became so critical that an emergency debate in the Canadian Parliament was called on the issue. In this audio from CBC on April 12th, the following exchange took place between the Minister of Health, Jane Philpott, and the NDP Member of Parliament representing the Attawapiskat First Nation, Charlie Angus.
The conditions that First Nations and Inuit communities are facing are absolutely unacceptable, and the mental health of young people, particularly in these communities, is devastating. Our department and our government is making sure that all the necessary services and programs are in place. We are currently investing over $300 million per year in mental wellness programs in these communities. We will continue to work with Indigenous leaders, and I will continue to work with the Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs to make sure that all appropriate resources are available.
The suicide crisis has shocked the world, and they're asking how a country as rich as Canada can leave so many young children and young people behind. And what the people in Attawapiskat are facing is the same systemic negligence that's robbing the hopes of young people in communities like La Loche and Cross Lake and Nescatanga. And yet there was no new mental health dollars in this budget to help Indigenous children. So enough of the Band-Aids and the emergency flights. Will this minister commit to a total overhaul to ensure that every child in this country have the mental health supports that they need to have hope and a positive future?
Great. The Honorable Minister of Health.
The member opposite has worked hard in his community to advocate for the mental health needs in that community, and I agree with him that it is completely unacceptable in a country as rich in resources as Canada that young people should get to the point that their life seems worthless and that they would want to end it. We must respond to this. I have already indicated what we are doing so far. I will be working with my colleagues across the country to make sure that mental health services are included and improved, and make sure that we get that mental health care to the people that need it.
If you were listening closely, you may have heard Angus mention the government use of Band-Aid measures, a term that means spending a lot of money to fix the immediate problem without fully addressing the root source or the cause of all the problems in the first place. You may have noticed as well that both of them are focusing on getting the community access to the quote-unquote mental health counseling, assuming that by forcing Indigenous youth to submit to Western-style white man's way of counseling will somehow fix the problem. The government claims to be spending $300 million on getting this help for communities, but this same money could probably have been better used training these communities to grow hemp and build biospheres where food could be grown through hydroponics and aquaponics projects, giving people practical skills to allow them to feel useful, which is far better than merely dumping a whole bunch of high-priced mental health counselors into a crisis situation to brainwash a culture that will not benefit from it. As you can perhaps now begin to appreciate, things get very complicated when the global cabal gets involved, and this is how they like it, because it means that the message given to the public can be vague and convoluted, even if it contains some elements of truth. CVN spoke with Bill Squire, spokesperson for the Grand River Mohawks. We will hear more from him in a moment, but this is what he specifically had to say about the situation in Attawapiskat.
My stand and input on Attawapiskat. I heard Trudeau come on made a statement on TV last week about maybe these people should consider moving. Maybe he thinks that's the answer to everything. But he did some research on Northern Ontario and the remote tribes up there in the 20s, 30s, and the 40s. Canada was in the process of putting them all on reserves up there and making their hunt illegal, so they couldn't be nomads anymore. They had to stay stationary, so they helped them build some tar paper shacks up there and made it illegal for them to leave. And this is the consequences now that's coming out here. I'll still maintain my view on it that as far as reconciliation goes and fixing things up, it's not going to happen until we regain original jurisdiction of the land that we're on right now, the land that we're in possession of. And that would be a starting point. And it would give Native people the right to negotiate under better terms with developers or mining companies or whatever. I think that's very important in restoring original jurisdiction. And that could give the Native people a lot better chance of negotiating and everything, because everything's all done for us under the Indian Act.
Squire mentions the Indian Act, this magical corporate commercial document of enslavement known as legislation. Bob Joseph, in a CBC.ca article on April 13th, noted 21 points about the Indian Act that many people may not know. The following are a sample of a few of the more important points. Joseph writes that the Indian Act denied women status, It introduced residential schools. It created reserves. It renamed individuals with European names. It restricted First Nations from leaving the reserve without permission from the Indian agent. The Act could expropriate portions of reserves for roads, railways, and other public works, as well as move an entire reserve away from a municipality if it was deemed expedient. The document forbade First Nations from forming political organizations. It prohibited anyone, First Nation or non-First Nation, from soliciting funds for First Nation legal claims without a special license from the Superintendent General. In other words, the government was attempting to prevent legal action against itself, and this could be considered the fox guarding the hen house. The Act also prohibited sale of ammunition to First Nations. It imposed the band council system. It forbade First Nations from speaking their native languages. The Act forbade First Nations from practicing their traditional religion, and it denied First Nations the right to vote. It created a permit system to control First Nations' ability to sell products from farms, and the Act was created under the British rule for the purpose of subjugating one race, Aboriginal peoples. The full list will be in the link for this story in the show summary. This is what commercial legislation has done to the indigenous nations that have given up their rights, freedoms, and their lands. It is also similar legislation, but on a grander scale, that enslaves humans to criminally fraudulent banking and legal systems. It was the day after this information about the Indian Act was posted that another article appeared on the Globe and Mail website for the 14th. In this article by Cesar Jaramillo, he writes that Canada has lost all credibility when it comes to human rights. In this article, Jaramillo is specifically referencing Canada's arms deals with Saudi Arabia, but this is only the tip of the iceberg. Human rights abuses have been going on with the indigenous nations since before Canada became a country, something that the Mohawk Initiative intends to prove. A second Globe and Mail article on the same day by Tanya Kappa and Hayden King echoes a bit of what Squire said moments ago. The article writes that the response from Canadians to these states of emergency has followed a predictable pattern. Suicides, or suicide attempts, lead to calls for help. There are news headlines, sad prime ministerial tweets, the dispatching of crisis teams, and then repeat. Explaining the source of these crises is relatively straightforward, but communities know the solutions too. Authentic opportunities for the full reclamation of our identities, our languages, our cultures, our traditions, and our relationship with the land and waters. This would require restored jurisdiction, honored treaties, healthcare, and education. This would bring an end to being forced to live in conditions of poverty. If we want to end indigenous suffering, we must end colonization. It is this that the Mohawk Initiative seeks to address on behalf of themselves and also indigenous groups across Canada and around the world. Now, specifically related to the Mohawks this week, there is not much to add regarding any positive feedback from the letters that have been sent. There was, however, a protest involving Idle No More and Black Lives Matter protesters who began to occupy offices of the Indigenous and Northern Affairs Ministry in Toronto, Winnipeg, and Vancouver. The occupation in Toronto was of particular concern to the Grand River Mohawks because the media was showing images of protesters with Mohawk flags and images. Bill Squire spoke upon this to CVN and wanted to make clear that any images or references to Mohawk involvement did not come with the official sanction of the Grand River Mohawks.
Well, yes, I think possibly there's some Mohawks. There are certainly people there with Mohawks ancestry who's not really authorized to speak on behalf of the Grand River Mohawks. So that's certainly out of our control, to control all the Mohawks across the land. Well, I can honestly say that they don't have the sanction of the Grand River Mohawks because I was really vague of what they really wanted to accomplish.
I understand several protesters at the scene of the occupation attempted to contact you. What might have been behind their reasons for doing so?
Some of the Mohawks who was supposedly inside of the protest, just trying to inform me what they wanted and what they said they were doing. What they hoped to accomplish was to get Trudeau to personally show up and add a office scat. I really never give them no sanction or anything. I just told them that they should be careful. Yeah, so I didn't really get involved with it, or nor did I want to, because I don't really know who's behind it or anything.
There's another possible concern here. This protest or occupation started on April 13th, and this came, if I'm not mistaken, about a week after an email that was sent to the chief's office on Friday concerning the issues that you wanted to address with the government of Ontario. Is this correct?
Yeah, the dates are correct. I really don't know if they're tied together or not. If that protest had any bearing on our letter or not, that remains to be seen yet.
The CBC reported on April 21st that the occupation in Toronto has ended 9 days after it began. Protests are still ongoing across Canada. The Grand River Mohawks have stated that it is their clear and preferred intention to seek to resolve all issues in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, and they do not seek to intentionally disrupt the daily lives of Canadians and of commerce. This does not mean, however, that this step may become necessary at some point in the future if the parties that have been named in the Mohawk Initiative do not seek to sit down and address all concerns honorably and with respect to humans and to the great tree of peace. In financial news, arguably the biggest news coming out of the last couple of weeks in the financial world could be China's launch of its yuan-based gold price fix. Although Wikipedia is not generally noted for being accurate on many occasions, a Wikipedia page regarding gold fixing describes the more recent history of gold fixing as follows. The London gold fixing is the setting of the price of gold that used to be held on the premises of Nathan Mayer Rothschild & Sons by the members of the London Gold Market Fixing Limited. However, in 2004, Nathan Mayer Rothschild left the precious metals business in London and sold its place on the fixing to Barclays Bank. From that time onwards, the fixing has taken place via a dedicated conference line. However, the benchmark is still determined twice each business day on the London bullion market. It is designed to fix a price for settling contracts between members of the London bullion market, but the gold fixing informally provides a recognized rate that is used as a benchmark for pricing the majority of gold products and derivatives throughout the world's markets. The gold fix is conducted in the United States dollar, the pound sterling, and the euro, daily at 10:30 a.m. and 3 p.m. London time. Assuming this page is still accurate, the page also notes that the current participants in the fixing are Barclays Bank, the Bank of China, Goldman Sachs, HSBC, Bank USA, JP Morgan Chase, Morgan Stanley, Société Générale, Standard Chartered, Scotia Mocatta or Scotiabank, the Toronto Dominion Bank, and UBS. Over the last number of years, however, there have been increasing rumors that there was less and less gold in some Western countries, and that, in fact, gold was being held in the U.S. on behalf of other countries has allegedly gone missing. Take a country like Canada, for example. It has been reported within the last several months on this newscast that Canada has been selling off the bulk of its gold reserves, the remainder of it anyway, and now it has apparently been confirmed that Canada sold the very last of its reserves, so there's now absolutely nothing left, which is strikingly odd considering the major movement of Russia and China in acquiring gold. However, I will return to this in a moment. An article on the Zero Hedge website on March the 3rd noted the following about Canada. This latest sell-off is indeed part of a much longer-term pattern of moving away from gold as a government-held asset. According to economist Ian Lee of the Sprott School of Business at Carleton University, Ottawa has no real reason to keep its gold reserves other than adhering to tradition. Under the old system, the gold-backed up currencies, Lee explained, the U.S. dollar was tied to gold. 1 ounce was worth $35 US. Then in 1971, for lots of reasons I won't get into, this is him speaking, Richard Nixon took the United States off the gold standard. Gold and dollars were interchangeable until that point, he said, but in the modern financial world, the metal is no longer considered a form of currency. It is a precious metal like silver. They can be sold like any asset. The article continues. According to Lee, there may soon come a time when Canada's gold reserves are entirely a thing of the past. There are better assets to focus on, he argued, calling the government's decision to dump gold wise and astute. As of early March, Canada has zero gold in its reserves. It was 3 years later, in 1974, that Canada, under the leadership of Pierre Trudeau, Justin's father, sold out the Bank of Canada to the Rothschilds' banking empire, thus collapsing the value of the Canadian dollar almost overnight, while formerly interest-free loans were taken over and the government was forced to start paying interest on these loans created out of thin air and transferring the penalties of these loans onto Canadians. It was back in January, in an article by Jason Hamlin on the goldstockbull.com website, who reported the following. After accumulating all of this gold, along with their close ally Russia, many believe they will eventually break the metal free from the price manipulation undertaken by the banks and governments of the United States and the United Kingdom. Once price discovery moves from west to east, they will allow the price to float to free market levels, and the value of all gold they have been accumulating will skyrocket. Removing the gold price suppression will be accompanied by wholesale dumping of U.S. Treasury bonds and test the world's faith in the U.S. dollar debt-based fiat currency system. This will give China, Russia, and others a greater influence in world financial markets and better stability in their currencies. It may give them a considerable strategic advantage over the United States, a nation that many believe no longer has the gold that they claim. Indeed, with a lack of a comprehensive audit and unwillingness of officials to allow one, many believe the gold is no longer in Fort Knox. They also launched their own international gold trading platform on the SGE, and this is in reference to China. It has become the largest physical gold exchange in the world, with an estimated 52 times more physical gold withdrawals versus the predominantly paper exchange of the COMEX. Fast forward to the first week of 2016, and China is warning foreign banks that they must participate in yuan-based gold price fixing or lose their Chinese gold import rights. This first ever Chinese benchmark is set to launch in April of this year and could be a game changer for gold prices moving forward. Then, a week ago on the 13th, CNBC reported that top Chinese banks and gold miners, along with the world's biggest jewelry retailer, will be among 18 members taking part in Beijing's new yuan-denominated gold benchmark, a source familiar with the matter said. 2 foreign banks will also join the benchmark setting process when it launches on the 19th, making China's biggest step to become a price setter for gold. An article on the superstation95.com website on April 13th also noted the following. In a shocking move likely to crush the U.S. economy overnight, China is refusing to make its new gold-backed yuan convertible from or to U.S. dollars. The new yuan will be introduced on Tuesday, April 19th, apparently. When the International Monetary Fund agreed to add the yuan to the basket of world currencies used for global reserves and international trade, they wanted China to make the yuan more reliable as a currency. Since then, China has almost unpegged its yuan from the dollar, allowing its value to fluctuate on world markets. But for years, China has been amassing huge amounts of gold bullion. Some have said their appetite for bullion has been staggering, and with a new gold-backed yuan set to be issued, the entire world will have a choice of a new currency to use for international trade. The old U.S. dollar, which is backed by nothing, or the new Chinese yuan, which is backed by gold. Which currency would you use? When this new currency is issued, countries that have been forced to use US dollars for decades and have had to keep billions of dollars in their foreign currency reserves, they will be free to dump those dollars. But they won't be able to dump them to China for the new gold-backed yuan. China has reportedly decided there can be no conversion of gold-backed yuan to or from US dollars. What China fears is that many countries around the world will want to trade their reserve US dollars for the new yuan, leaving China with mountains of worthless US dollars. At this time, it is unclear if China actually did formally launch a gold-backed currency, or whether it was quietly introduced, or whether it has even been launched yet. The move to introduce the new yuan-based gold fix is significant enough by itself. What this means to all the other nations and corporate entities who have yet to agree to these terms, remains to be seen. During the week of the 13th, various sources were reporting significant activity in the banking community, with financial ministers attending a flurry of emergency meetings, banker summits, and there was at least one meeting between President Obama and the head of the Federal Reserve, Janet Yellen. Mike Maloney of goldsilver.com reported in an interview published on that website how it is highly unusual for the Fed to invoke expedited procedures in having impromptu meetings behind closed doors. An article on the SprottMoney.com website by Jeff Nielsen attempts to explain the role of gold as a standard for the global economy. Nelson writes that a white paper previously released on this topic explained how and why a gold standard was the optimal basis for a monetary system in our modern economy. That same paper then provided extensive empirical evidence documenting the horrific economic damage that resulted from the loss of our gold standard in the early 1970s. This reply infers the U.S. When our nations had gold as the money of governments and silver as the money of the people, we enjoyed a level of prosperity and economic stability that we have not seen either before or since that era. In the 4.5 decades since, those metals have lost their official monetary status. Our economies have been destroyed, our governments have been bankrupted, and the currency in our wallets is fundamentally worthless. Decades of relentless brainwashing in the West have convinced the vast majority of our populations that there is no longer a place or role in our modern economy for perfect money. Consequently, the masses in the West generally shun gold and silver by storing and protecting only a tiny percentage of their wealth with these metals, in comparison with any other era in our society's history. This is how gold and silver stand today from a Western perspective. What is continually forgotten beneath the veneer of our cultural ignorance is that the rest of the world, and the vast majority of humanity's population, have a fundamentally opposite perspective regarding the world's only perfect money. Essentially, what Nielsen is saying is that the East and the peoples of those countries are more focused on economics and currencies based in real value, as opposed to a fiat currency system based on nothing but thin air that promotes debt, fear, enslavement, and thus control of the people. Nelson continues, "The West's gold is gone, yet out of one side of their mouths these rancid governments boast of supposedly gigantic reserves, while out of the other side of their mouths they continually denigrate its importance as a monetary asset. Gold is a barbarous relic. One would never hear such ignorance and idiocy emanating out of the East, or anywhere outside of the corrupt West." Western governments and their deluded populations are about to get a history lesson and economics lesson all rolled into one. It could and should also be a lesson in humility, though that is likely too much for us to hope, Nielsen adds. With China and Russia stockpiling massive amounts of gold at this time, Nielsen closes with the following. The purpose of such massive stockpiling can only be with the intent of resurrecting the gold standard. The difference would be that these Eastern nations could and will occupy the driver's seat of the new system which will replace the fraudulent Western system of unbacked and totally debauched paper currencies. He who has the gold makes the rules. The world in the East has never ceased to recognize that golden rule. The world in the West now contemptuously scorns this eternal wisdom. Another expression, long forgotten in the arrogant West: pride cometh before a fall. It would seem that in Western countries there are indeed on the verge of a very big fall. In the show summary, we'll include a YouTube video of actor Jean-Claude participating in a French political discussion program, and he comes out to name the Rothschilds banking cartel by name, and he states to the audience that he is aware. In keeping with the topic of financial activity coming out of the East this week, an article appearing on the BRICS Post website on April 16th has reported that the BRICS Bank has now announced the first set of loans to be approved by the bank. Not surprisingly, the loans are being directed towards energy projects that will directly strike at the heart of the cabal-controlled oil and coal industries for energy production. The article reports that the new development bank, a just opened institution co-owned by the BRICS countries of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, has announced its first investments. The BRICS Bank on Friday announced that its board of directors has approved the first set of loans involving financial assistance of $811 million to be dispersed in tranches supporting 2,370 megawatts of renewable energy capacity. The fifth Board of Directors meeting was held in Washington on the sidelines of the IMF and World Bank Group spring meetings. The new lender is providing $300 million to Brazil, $81 million to China, $250 million to India, and $180 million to South Africa. The article adds that there are many more new projects in the pipeline, including projects from Russia. They are at various stages of consideration or appraisal, the new development bank spokesperson said. The NDB board has approved the issuance of 5-year bonds in Chinese yuan. Russian Finance Minister Anton Siluanov was quoted as saying on Friday, "The bank will raise funds on the Chinese market, and once it receives a rating from international ratings agencies, it will also tap international markets," Russia's Interfax news agency quoted Siluanov as saying. An article on the geopolitics.com website on the 17th went into a little bit more detail, reporting that, as many are already aware of, the IMF World Bank financing backlog in the region is too high, on top of which is the unfavorable rules the region has been subjected to, referring to Asia, meaning these Western-dominated banks are being used for geopolitical dictatorial objectives, most notorious of which is the exclusive veto rights of the United States. Collective efforts by the BRICS are now being exerted to correct this imbalance. Until now, the IMF has been biased against developing nations, a problem that the new development banks are correcting. And it is this creation that is also forcing the U.S. to finally agree to 2010 IMF reforms that they have been blocking until now because of the growth of developing nations, especially within the BRICS. The article goes on. According to Russian Finance Minister, GDP is one of the key indicators, and its greater weight in the formula will take into account the interests of developing countries, which are now underrepresented in the IMF as their economies are developing dynamically. The reform of the IMF was adopted back in 2010, but was delayed until December of 2015 due to the position of the U.S. Congress when it ratified the so-called 14th General Quota Review. Under the new rules, China's quota has reached 6.4%. Russia and India now have 2.7% each, with Brazil and South Africa having 2.3% and 0.6% respectively. This gives a total of 14.7% against 11.5% previously. The U.S. is the biggest member of the IMF and is the only one to have a veto, as 15% is the blocking share. The pressure is building on the West to change their tune. The article notes that establishing a parallel financial system, SERP, meaning a gold-backed yuan credit rating agency, establishing a new commercial sea lane like the Iranian Canal, revival of the ancient Silk Road, and defeating multiple attempts at starting a full-blown nuclear exchange in Syria and Ukraine are all forcing the West to play fair game with the East, and are primarily aimed at attenuating the undeserved geopolitical and financial power of the Khazarian banking cabal. For many, the end of this game cannot come soon enough. In general news, I had the opportunity recently to connect with John Perkins, author of Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and also author of a newly released book, The New Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Perkins' website offers the following. As a chief economist at a major international consulting firm, John Perkins advised the World Bank, United Nations, IMF, U.S. Treasury Department, Fortune 500 corporations, and leaders of countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. I wanted to ask him a few questions about a few things that have been happening lately in the world and to seek his perspective on those issues. In some cases, he was able to offer more information than on other issues. CVN acknowledges that John Perkins is one of a very small handful of people who have made themselves available to CVN for the purposes of interviews, and I am extremely grateful to Mr. Perkins for sharing his time with me. You may have to listen a little bit more closely as at times the audio appears a bit rough. The Panama Papers, the mainstream media, in an unusual turn of events, has picked up on this story, and this strikes me as being a possible red flag. What are you seeing playing out here? Is this another desperate attempt to destabilize Russia? Is the cabal turning on each other and possibly throwing some under the bus? Is this what could be happening with Cameron because of Brexit or Clinton because of her possible indictment?
Those are all possibilities. I certainly don't have any information to indicate one way or another. It's a little difficult to believe given that Iceland is so involved and that Cameron is so deeply involved. And the fact is, I think the Panama Papers are really raising consciousness among many people. We're seeing a lot of the mainstream press come out with some pretty strong statements around banking and so forth. So it's a little hard for me to believe that this is some sort of cabal that's staged by the corporatocracy to work to their advantage. I think that the real significance of the Panama Papers is that they're exposing the underbelly of the system that just isn't working. And let's face it, most of these people that are being named didn't do anything illegal. What they did should be illegal. And that's an indictment of the system, in my opinion, much more than it is of the individuals. Putin himself, as I understand it, has not been named. So it's a very strong indictment of our legal system.
Well, you certainly are absolutely correct there. And certainly there is a lot of truth contained within the papers, and I believe you are right. There is a consciousness shift that is connected to part of this going out. It just seems to be a very different strategy. As you mentioned, Iceland is included, and Iceland has been going gangbusters on trying to take care of its own electoral and constitution and financial affairs, and now that the Pirate Party is moving up in there, this could possibly be a reason to target them, but I am intrigued by this particular turn of events because this isn't something the mainstream media usually does.
No, you're right. But in a way, I think it's something they couldn't really ignore, just like they couldn't ignore Edward Snowden. They couldn't ignore WikiLeaks. They attacked those individuals, but in this case, the individual has stayed anonymous, which is probably wise that individual's part. And we've got something like 100 journalists who've been involved in interpreting, and I understand that they're still doing that. A lot of these papers are done in some sort of, are encrypted in some way that they're having to decipher. I think it's really important to always be skeptical and assume that there's a story beneath the story, and there probably is a number of stories beneath the story, and yet in the long run I think these papers are a threat to the system. I would certainly hope that enough people are waking up
by reading about these to understand that this is an incredibly corrupt system that we have in the United States and elsewhere. We're the biggest banana republic the world has ever known, but we don't want to admit it. We want to talk about how there's corruption in Brazil, there's corruption in Argentina, there's corruption in the Middle East, there's corruption everywhere else, but we're not corrupt. And I think that used to be a lot truer than it is today, and it's still true, of course, that we don't have to slip a $10 bill to the postal agent or customs official or something to get our package, but our corruption is on a much, much larger basis, and in fact, legal corruption. And so, legally speaking, it isn't corruption.
Right.
That's a real condemnation of this system.
Now, one of the articles that I was following, someone has done a little bit of research on some of the funders for the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, and the Sloan Foundation, I believe, is funded by George Soros, and there are certain other foundations that have, shall we call it, a suspicious background as far as their history to various cabals, the Carnegie Endowment and the Kellogg Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation and others. There does appear to be a link to some suspicious funding to the ICIJ. Does any of that ring a bell with you? Are you familiar with the Sloan Foundation by any chance?
Not intimately familiar with it. I wouldn't be surprised if it's involved in the funding here. And the question would be, of course, do the 100 journalists or however plus journalists that are involved in this take orders from the Sloan Foundation? I don't know, but I would suspect that certainly a good share of them do not, even if some of them do. There's a lot of foundations doing a lot of things, and some of the biggest ones do some pretty bad things, but that doesn't mean that everything they do is connected with a conspiracy. It may be, and I think it's important to remain skeptical. But I would rather see us encouraging people to look at this as a total condemnation of the system. Whoever has exposed it, it's been exposed. And if somebody exposed it, some cabal exposed it for nefarious reasons that don't meet the immediate eye, let us turn this around and use it like a good martial artist. Throw the energy back at them and use it as a way to really attack what's terribly wrong with this broken system we have, a system where bankers and wealthy people and politicians can get away with hiding their money. Let's change that.
Let's switch over to Ukraine. Now, Poroshenko was also mentioned in the papers, and earlier this week, Prime Minister Yatsenyuk has announced his resignation. Are there some connections that you're seeing here based on your historical knowledge or things that you may be hearing now, or is there a dramatic unfolding in Ukraine because the puppet regime that the U.S. and Israel put in there appears to now be failing?
Yeah, I think that's entirely possible. That certainly that we're trying to do something about that regime. Here again, we look at the corruption. Ukraine had a democratically elected president who began to side with the Russians and against some of our corporations like Monsanto, and he was overthrown in a coup and replaced by a new administration. And now the inheritors of that situation seem to be failing. So what do you suppose the CIA is doing at this point? It's hard to tell, but that certainly is a possibility that they're using this opportunity to try to get that regime out of power and replace it with a new, stronger one. Once again, I think what we do know is that we overthrew a democratically elected administration in Ukraine because they began to lean toward Russia and they stood up to big U.S. corporations, including Monsanto. You don't do that and get away with it, especially not when you're in charge of a country like Ukraine that has some of the richest agricultural lands in that part of the world.
Given your former background as an economic hitman, I'm going to shift a little more for a moment here down to Brazil, South America. Right now, Brazil is being targeted because it appears, at least from what signs seem to be indicating, it appears that Brazil may be the weakest link in the BRICS chain. So, given what your past experience has taught you, is Brazil being targeted perhaps because of the Olympics in the hopes that they can somehow bankrupt Brazil and try and put this wedge further on all the tools that China and Russia are currently trying to introduce into the financial system to compete against the IMF and the BIS and the World Bank, etc.?
There's no question that our institutions are trying to weaken the BRICS and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB, both of which have been organized by China and have more assets than the World Bank and IMF combined, and it's tended for much greater assets. And they're making huge inroads in places like Latin America and other parts of Europe and the Middle East and Africa. The Chinese are digging in, and in a way they've learned from our mistakes. They learned lessons from our successes. They see the World Bank model as kind of a success, and now they're going about forming their own. They've learned from our mistakes and that they're not sending military troops into all these countries as we've done over the years. They haven't assassinated any leaders of any of these countries or overthrown the government, with the exception, of course, of what they've done in their own immediate community of Tibet and Taiwan, that area. They haven't reached out to the rest of the world as the United States has done. And so the Chinese certainly have positioned themselves as a real competitor to our system. And there can be no doubt that the World Bank, the IMF, and the many institutions that support them are trying very hard to undermine BRICS and AIIB and other Chinese efforts. And again, I also see them having to bend their policies a little bit. The World Bank and its sister organizations have become somewhat more lenient in the way they look at the conditionality that they impose on other countries, because they now see that they have competition. And this is a good thing. Since the demise of the Soviet Union in 1991, these organizations, the World Bank, IMF, and other similar sister organizations, have had the rule of have just ruled the roost. They haven't had any competition. Now they suddenly get competition, and they don't like it. And so, yes, there's many efforts abroad to weaken that system. And certainly the overthrow or the demise of the current liberal regime in countries like Brazil will assist in that effort to overthrow them. There's no question about that.
You've released another book recently, The New Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Would you like to share any thoughts about what readers might possibly expect from the new book?
Thanks. Yes, it is out. It's available on any online book vendor or any bookstore. It summarizes the stuff that's in the first book. But what's most important, why did I write the New Confession? Because during these 12 years since the first one came out, we've seen the system get much worse. So this economic hitman system that we've been discussing and that I write about as having participated in the developing countries has now spread to the United States, Europe, and the rest of the world. And so has the jackal system. Those people who go in and use violence, assassination, coups, and so forth. That's spread too. And we're seeing that. We're seeing tremendous pressure on politicians in the United States, both coming from economic hitman type people and jackal type people. We're seeing this happen increasingly here in this country and in Europe and places like Italy and Greece and Iceland, as you mentioned, Ireland, Spain, Portugal. At the same time, I've been traveling around the world during these 12 years, speaking in all kinds of venues, and I'm feeling a tremendous awakening, a consciousness revolution, a big revolution that's happening of people really understanding that the system doesn't work. And all this other information that's come out in the last 12 years, the WikiLeaks, the Edward Snowden papers, the Panama Papers, Michael Moore's movies, so many things have come out, so that people really are waking up. And I wrote this book to expose all of that, both sides of that. And also, it has a lot of chapters devoted to what we all can do to change that, what you and I and all your listeners can do to change the system. There's a list of things people can do. Above all, we need to recognize that this system is run by big corporations, not by the President of the United States or any other politicians. They are under the control of corporations. Even if we get a president elected who accepts no money from corporations, he or she will be surrounded by people who do. So we need to recognize that corporations run the world, and yet they have to give in to us. They understand that they only exist because we buy their goods and services or invest in them or work for them or support them for our tax dollars or all of those. And we, the people, need to understand that we have to take back control. And that means convincing these corporations that we're only going to buy from them if they start turning things around and convert a failed economic system into a successful economic system, both of which I describe in detail in the book. The death economy, as I call the failed system, and the life economy, which is the system we're in the process of moving into and need to do it a lot faster.
John is actively involved as an agent for positive change in the world these days. His website writes that John is a founder and board member of Dream Change and the Pachamama Alliance, nonprofit organizations devoted to establishing a world future generations will want to inherit. He has lectured at Harvard, Oxford, and more than 50 other universities around the world and is the author of books on indigenous cultures and transformation, including Shapeshifting, The World as You Dream It, Psychonavigation, Spirit of the Shuar, and The Stress-Free Habit. The Mohawk Initiative seeks to create the lands and the economic conditions described by Perkins, and links will also be in the show summary for those wishing to learn more about his foundation and alliance for positive global change. Thank you for your service to humanity, John, and thank you for your acknowledgement of CVN as being worthy of your time to connect with me. In this week's Final Words, an article appeared on the cbc.ca news website on April 18th, written by Duncan McHugh, and it got me fired up enough that I felt I needed to devote a commentary to this subject. Since the beginning of the Mohawk Initiative, I have been attempting to help listeners understand the somewhat complex nature of how Indigenous nations, not only in Canada, but in the U.S. and around the world, have been forced to give up their freedoms and natural rights by being forced into corporate entity groups in those countries. In the U.S., one name given to the corporate entity group is tribe. In Canada, a corporate entity Indigenous group is known as a band. These bands, at least in Canada, are overseen by an unelected corporate entity known as the Assembly of First Nations, and they answer to a piece of legislation called the Indian Act. It is this entity and this legislation that serves to represent the interests of the corporate band entities when dealing with the federal government. The federal government, as a corporate entity unto itself, only deals with the corporate entity groups, and so far up to now has generally not acknowledged the existence of Indigenous nations that have neither surrendered their rights, freedoms, nor their lands to the federal government. The basis for this acknowledgement lies within the corporate commercial structure of the Admiralty Courts of Law. This has also been explained previously on this newscast. Before the existence of modern communications and modern trade, trading and commercial business was done via ships. The law that governed commerce upon the seas was known as Admiralty Law or Law of the Seas. This system of law existed to govern contractual obligations between corporate entities seeking to do business with each other. The courts had the jurisdiction to rule on disputes relating to commerce only. Over time, this law was exported to land, and in order for this law to have effect, it required governments and the courts to create commercial entities. Because people would not likely consent to becoming a commercial entity, had they fully known and understood what it would mean, a number of systems and tricks were devised to trick people into accepting a corporate fiction identity. Therefore, when one goes into court, the system is immediately rigged against them, for the rules of commercial law will be enforced upon them because most have no idea how to properly defend themselves against this criminally fraudulent system. Yet, the government continues to steal lands and funds from these free and natural Indigenous groups, because, up to now, most free and natural Indigenous groups have not been able to find the support of people with legal knowledge to assist them in exercising their rights and freedoms. Hiring a lawyer who has an oath to serve the British Accreditation Registry, or Bar Association, is sworn to uphold commercial law, not the natural law that governed Indigenous nations long before the colonizers came. As we heard earlier, another crisis has been occurring at the remote Indigenous community of Attawapiskat in northern Ontario. The article by McHugh compares the Attawapiskat First Nation community to the Snuneymuxw First Nation located within the urban boundaries of Nanaimo, British Columbia, on Canada's west coast. McHugh writes the following: Snuneymuxw First Nation is totally unlike the isolated community of Attawapiskat in that it's located in an urban center within the city boundaries of Nanaimo, BC. But, like many First Nations, Joachim's community experienced clusters of suicides as he was growing up, he says. In addition to his mother, he lost many cousins and says it was devastating not only to families, but also the entire community. Snuneymuxw has been suicide-free for 5 years now. Joachim credits the turnaround to community efforts to offer athletic programs to youth, and more importantly, a determination to include youth in reviving traditional Snuneymuxw culture. Connecting the community and culture is our main template, and we're having some positive results. In this community, it is reported that Snuneymuxw youth have a canoe club that helps to develop both mental and physical strength. According to McHugh, canoe clubs aren't the only healthy option for Snuneymuxw youth. Basketball, lacrosse, and soccer programs are also thriving. The community is proudly planning the grand opening of its new gym next month, a $4 million recreational facility that Snuneymuxw First Nation built mostly with its own economic development revenue. Not a dime came from the federal government, says Joachim, explaining the gym offers a space for young athletes to gather, but also houses a growing number of cultural workshops on everything from language and weaving and drum making. We need to create space, whether through sport or culture or recreation, to make people feel alive, Joachim says. The headline for this story reads, "For First Nations facing suicide crisis, the solution is rooted in the community." It sounds pretty good, one might feel inclined to say. Therefore, what is the question then? This headline, at least to me, is potentially very misleading. As this article notes, there is a difference between Attawapiskat and Snuneymuxw. One group lives in an urban center completely surrounded by the world of the colonizers. Another group in a more remote location has been cheated more and more out of its lands, partly because there is a De Beers diamond mine not too far away, and this is one of the colonizers' ways in which the natural hunting and living of remote indigenous groups has been adversely impacted. McHugh seems to feel that the solution only rests within the community, and it is to this that I am taking exception. The problem is that this statement, technically speaking, is true. The solution is rooted within the community. The problem is that McHugh is focusing on the wrong solution. McHugh appears to have no understanding of the true nature of the band system, or the Commercial Indian Act that governs the enslavement of Indigenous nations. Just as Canadians are enslaved as corporate entities to commercial rules given the force of law, so too have the Indigenous nations been enslaved to commercial rules that strip away their rights and freedoms. The solution that McHugh seems to advocate, increasing the immersion of Indigenous nations into the colonists' culture, as a solution, conveniently hides and possibly even negates the roles of all levels of governance and all roles of corporate responsibility, in creating a world where the Indigenous wisdom can not only survive, but also thrive. Many will have the incorrect vision that a return to Indigenous values means having to give up all the pleasures and conveniences that we currently enjoy, to return to some kind of nomadic lifestyle. This, of course, is not necessarily true. As the Mohawk Initiative hopes to demonstrate over the coming years, it is possible to exist with conveniences of modernization. The difference will be, however, that these conveniences will be designed, built, and used with greater consideration given to the health of humanity and the planet. There will be numerous conveniences that will disappear, such as vehicles operated by gas and diesel. These will be replaced with other technologies that we are now beginning to see in our reality. It is not just the responsibility of an Indigenous nation to embrace the culture of the colonists. Indeed, I would argue that this is extremely harmful, for it begins to wipe out the needed earth wisdom that the Indigenous nations protected until this time when it would be sorely needed. It requires everyone to begin making conscious choices to honor life in all its forms, and to begin forcing politicians to change the structures of governance so that governance adequately, fairly, and honorably serves both humanity and the planet. It requires corporations to change their structures so that profit does not come ahead of health or the destruction of the planet. Mr. McHugh, if this commentary should ever cross your path, I challenge you in your failure to acknowledge the responsibility of politicians, corporate bureaucrats, and also journalists in the media. People like you, seeking to impose responsibility of the enslaved to become like their enslavers, as opposed to the enslavers being held to accountability for their crimes while restoring the lands and freedoms, so everyone can give and live in greater harmony under the great tree of peace. Create a wonderful week until our next moment of now. So that is a sample of the unfolding higher consciousness news around the world this week. Cosmic Vision News is broadcast weekly from the CosmicVisionNews.com website. Links to stories used in this broadcast are published in the show summary, which is available on the blog on the website. CVN can be followed through its Facebook page, Scene page, and YouTube channel, as well as on Twitter, Google+, and LinkedIn. Thank you for sharing your time with me. I'm Jeffrey West, reminding you that it is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. Until our next moment of now, stay grounded in love, hold the vision of light and peace in your hearts, and keep your eyes to the skies. Disclosure is unfolding all around you. Namaste.